A chilly morning breeze swept across the vast farmland, carrying the scent of freshly turned soil and the faint rustle of wheat fields stretching beyond the horizon. The early sun cast a golden glow over the land, painting long shadows across the worn-out tractor parked near a dilapidated barn. John Miller, a hard-working farmer in his mid-50s, stood at the edge of his field, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the crisp air. His face was lined with years of struggle, his hands rough and calloused from decades of labor. He had been fighting an uphill battle for years. Rising costs, unpredictable weather, and an economy that seemed stacked against small farmers had left him on the verge of losing everything. His farm, once passed down through generations, now stood at the brink of foreclosure. But today, he wasn't thinking about his struggles. Today, a presidential motorcade was passing through town, and he had come out to see it. Just like everyone else in the small farming community of Nebraska, the crowd had gathered near the main road, waving flags and holding up signs as the convoy of black SUVs and limousines approached. Secret Service agents scanned the area, their eyes sharp and alert. The tension in the air was palpable as one of the limousines suddenly slowed down and came to a stop right in front of John's farm. The door opened, and out stepped Donald Trump. The crowd fell silent for a moment, caught off guard. No one had expected the former president to actually get out of the vehicle in the middle of a rural farm town. John stood frozen as Trump's sharp blue eyes landed directly on him. The former president, dressed in his signature navy suit, white shirt, and bright red tie, took a few steps forward, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket as he surveyed the surroundings. "You the owner of this place?" Trump asked, his voice carrying across the field. John cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Yes, sir. John Miller." Trump nodded, glancing at the barn, the half-broken fence, and the tractor that looked like it had seen better days. He turned back to John. "You've been farming a long time." "All my life," John said, his voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "This land's been in my family for 3 generations." Trump exhaled, scanning the fields before locking eyes with John again. "And how's it going?" John hesitated. No cameras were rolling. No media. Just a real conversation. He decided to be honest. "Not great, sir. Costs keep going up. Crops aren't selling like they used to, and these big corporations, they're swallowing up family farms like mine. I'm fighting to keep my land, but the bank's knocking on my door." Trump listened, his expression unreadable, his arms crossed. But his eyes didn't leave John's face. Then, after a pause, he spoke. "You know, I've met a lot of farmers in my time. Hardest working people in this country. You don't take handouts, you don't whine. You just put your head down and get the job done. And Washington? They don't get it. They never have." John nodded. "That's the truth." Trump took another step closer, lowering his voice slightly. "So tell me, John, if you had a chance to fix it, what would you do?" John was stunned. No one had ever asked him that before. He swallowed, glancing back at his land, then back at Trump. "I'd break the monopoly those big corporations have over the market," he said firmly. "Give small farmers a fair shot. Cut the regulations that make it impossible for us to compete. And I'd bring back the respect farmers used to have in this country." A slow smile crossed Trump's face. "You're a smart guy, John. More sense than half the people I've dealt with in D.C. John let out a small chuckle, but Trump wasn't joking. "Tell you what," Trump said, turning to one of his aides standing near the limo. "Get his number. I want to connect him with some folks." John's eyes widened. "Sir?" Trump smirked. "You got ideas. Real ones. Not the kind cooked up in Washington offices." "I want to hear more." The aide hurried over, handing John a card and taking down his contact information. The small crowd watching the interaction stood in stunned silence. Trump turned back to John. "I don't make promises I can't keep, but what I can tell you is this. You're not forgotten. The people like you, the ones who built this country, you still matter." John felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent years feeling like just another number, like the struggles of small-town America didn't matter to the people in power. But standing there on his own land, with Donald Trump looking him in the eye and telling him otherwise, it meant something. "Thank you, sir," John said, his voice firm. Trump extended a hand. John gripped it tightly, shaking it with the strength of a man who had spent his entire life fighting to survive. As Trump got back into the limousine, the crowd erupted in cheers, realizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. John watched as the convoy drove away, still holding the business card in his hand. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he thought he had lost. Hope! John stood there for a long moment, staring at the business card in his rough, calloused hands. The golden embossing of Donald Trump's name and the contact information printed on it felt almost surreal. He had spent years feeling like no one in power even knew he existed, let alone cared about the struggles of small farmers. Yet, in the span of a few unexpected minutes, the former President of the United States had stood in his field, listened to his worries, and told him that his voice mattered. The crowd around him was still murmuring, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others excitedly chatting about what had just happened. A few came up to him, patting him on the back, congratulating him as if he had just won something. But John knew that nothing was certain yet. This wasn't a promise. It was an opportunity. Later that evening, John sat at his kitchen table, the business card placed right in front of him. The farmhouse was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. He could still see his father's old tools hanging in the shed through the window, a reminder of the generations that had come before him. His wife, Sarah, walked in and placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. She had been out at the store when everything happened, but by the time she returned, the whole town was already buzzing with the news. "You gonna call?" she asked gently, sitting across from him. John exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I don't know. I mean, what if this was just a moment, a show? He meets people all the time. Maybe he won't even remember." Sarah shook her head. "You don't know that. Maybe he does remember. Maybe he meant what he said. The question is, do you believe in your own ideas enough to fight for them?" John looked at her for a long moment. He had spent years watching his farm struggle, watching his neighbors lose everything, watching corporate giants buy up land that had been in families for generations. He had spent countless nights wondering if his children would even have a future in farming, or if the land he loved would be lost forever. And then he picked up the phone. The next morning, John's phone rang. He nearly dropped it when he saw the number, a Washington, D.C. area code. He answered, his voice steady despite his nerves. "John, it's Donald." John blinked. "Mr. Trump?" "Yeah. I told you I'd remember," Trump said with a slight chuckle. "Listen, I spoke to some people. I want you to come to New York next week. I want to hear more about what you told me yesterday." John's heart pounded. "You mean, like, a meeting? With who?" Trump's voice was firm. "With me. And some folks who actually want to fix this mess." John felt like he couldn't breathe for a moment. He had expected a polite email, maybe a call from some staffer offering empty words. But this? A meeting with the man himself? "I don't know what to say," John admitted, his voice cracking slightly. Trump chuckled again. "You'll figure it out. Just bring your ideas and a plane ticket. See you next week, John." The call ended. John sat in stunned silence, the phone still pressed against his ear. His wife, who had been watching, leaned forward. "Well," John slowly set the phone down and looked at her, a mix of disbelief and excitement in his eyes. "We're going to New York." Outside, the field stretched far and wide, the sun rising over them. For the first time in a long time, John felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't fighting alone anymore. John stood at the airport terminal, a worn leather duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He had barely slept since the phone call, his mind racing with possibilities. As he stepped onto the plane bound for New York City, he couldn't shake the feeling that his entire life was about to change. When he landed, a black SUV was already waiting for him. The driver, a sharp-looking man in a suit, simply nodded and opened the door. No questions, no explanations, just a quiet drive through the bustling streets of Manhattan. Soon, the vehicle pulled up outside Trump Tower, its towering golden exterior gleaming under the city lights. John had seen it on TV before, but standing in front of it now, it felt surreal. The driver led him inside, through the marble lobby, past security, and into a sleek private elevator that ascended straight to the top floor. When the doors opened, John stepped into an elegant conference room overlooking the skyline, the vast city sprawling beneath him. And there, standing near the massive glass window, was Donald Trump himself, hands in his pockets, gazing out over the city. Trump turned, flashing his signature smirk. "John, you made it." John nodded, still trying to process it all. "Yes, sir." Trump gestured to a chair at the long, polished table. "Sit down. Let's talk." John sat, his hands resting on the smooth wooden surface. Before he could even gather his thoughts, the door opened again, and several high-profile business leaders and agricultural experts walked in, taking their seats. Some of them nodded at John. Others eyed him curiously. Trump leaned forward. "All right, John, this is your moment. Tell us what's wrong with American farming, and how we fix it." John took a deep breath, his nerves settling. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a CEO. He was a farmer, a man who knew what it was like to struggle, to fight, to survive. And now, sitting in a room full of powerful people, he was about to do something he never thought possible: make them listen.